Hi folks, welcome to Set Apart Homestead. This is Travis here at the Prepared Homestead. Thank you all for stopping by to watch. Today, I want to answer a question that's been asked of me recently, and really it's an ongoing question amongst preppers. And that question is how to prepare if whatever happens, the apocalypse is basically permanent and society never comes back. So that's something I want to kind of go into today. I think it's, especially with all the stuff that's going on, it might be something that you want to start thinking about, because a lot of prepping tends to live under the assumption that at some point society will come back. At some point government, get my hat straight there, some point government will come back, and industry and that kind of stuff. But there's some of the more advanced preppers and awake people think that there's a possibility that may never happen. So that's where I kind of want to go with today's video. Before we get started, if you would, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it around with your family, friends, and social media and all that kind of stuff. So, I was thinking about this, and I had someone ask the other day on the channel in a comment asking about, how, I can't remember the exact wording of the question, but how do you prepare if what you're preparing for is complete destruction and there is no coming back to any kind of normalcy? And I take this in two different directions. Number one, and let's play out a couple of scenarios with everything that's going on today, and it just seems to be worse and worse, and there's always something new and some new crazy catastrophe that's going on. I think that there is a possibility, not probable, maybe, probably not likely, but I think there's a possibility that we could experience a major civilization reset. I don't know how else to put it. That something happens, whether it's multiple things at once or it all leads up to some big natural or man-made apocalyptic level disaster that basically knocks humanity back a few hundred years in advancement. So how do you deal with that? The other scenario, I think, is a possibility, although I think preparing for them are the same, is that some type of one world government system develops that's so totalitarian that you have basically two options. One is to completely give up your liberty, your rights, your freedom, your autonomy and everything to conform to their ways, live in their big cities in their little box apartments, or survive on your own somewhere, and know that you can't go resupply because you just, it's not possible. If you don't have the certain microchip in your skin or something, you can't engage in commerce, so you're pretty much on your own. Anyways, I think how to prepare for this type of stuff is a little different than your standard. Sorry, there's a little bit of sun glare, but I don't think I can do anything about it right now. I think preparing for these are a little different than your standard run-of-the-mill preparing for being out of a job for 6 months, or the economy taking a dip for a year or two, or a pandemic that lasts 18 to 24 months. That sort of thing, where you're preparing to be down or in a bad situation for a set amount of time, knowing that at some point things will kind of come back to normal and you'll be able to resupply and so on and so forth. Whereas this kind of situation is that you'll never have a chance to resupply. So your way of preparing, you need to prepare because there's no chance of resupplying fuel, food, parts, repairs to equipment and stuff. So how do you prepare for that? And that's kind of where I'm going. I know this is very hypothetical, and I'm not saying that these scenarios that I'm creating are likely, but I do think it's a good idea for us as preppers. I'm really sorry about that glare. It's kind of getting worse. I don't think I can. I'm trying to move my tripod around. Sorry for the jerkiness. I am not a professional. The reason why I bring this up is because I think if we incorporate this line of thinking into our prepping plans and the way that we prepare and the type of things that we prepare, it actually makes us more prepared. Because it's trying to think of the right words. Because prepping has become popular, and not just because of the COVID-19 and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking even before then. Over the last 5 years, 10 years or so, it's become kind of popular. There's been shows on TV that's kind of popularized it. There's a whole industry that's kind of grown up around prepping and survival. And so there's new technology. There's things that are being designed and built just for prepping and just for survival. And I don't knock that. It's not a bad thing. But the downside to it is that preppers, especially newer ones that didn't come from a survival background, the survivalist kind of movement, which is where I came out of. I mean, I know I'm not real old, but I'm old enough to I caught the tail end of that. It was different back then. You didn't, your equipment and the things that you didn't have the high speed, super ultra tactical gear, the, high tech, chargeable, wind up, solar, whatever, radios and all that kind of stuff. You either had stuff that the technology was probably World War II era, or it was just primitive. And that's how you survived. And so I think if we're going to play out these scenarios of what if society never comes back, or at least doesn't come back in our lifetime, how do we prepare for it? And I think the answer is we have to be prepared to live primitively, pre-industrially, and pre-technology. We have to, kind of live in a way of, say, the original homesteaders, the homesteaders from the late 1800s, or, even the pioneers from like the early 1800s. That's kind of the area that we need to kind of focus on, at least on some things. Of course, you can use a modern tool, but having something that's electrical, gas, and that being your only means of doing something is with an electrical or gas operated tool. Things could get to where you don't have the electricity and the gas, and then what are you going to do? And I know a lot of people are able to afford things like solar power, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not poo-pooing it, but it is also a system that could fail. It is not fail-proof. It's still uncertain of how it could stand up to a EMP or a CME, electromagnetic pulse, coronal mass ejection. It's uncertain of how well they can stand up to that. Also, batteries fail over time. Solar panels become less and less, they absorb less and less energy, and over time they eventually fail. So becoming completely dependent on that kind of a source, what happens when that fails? If your source is fuel, when the fuel dries up, and I know people look into kind of making their own fuel, and that is a possibility, but it's difficult to make enough fuel. So my point is, whether it's your primary way of prepping or it's your backup prepping, and with me it's usually my contingency plan prepping, although some of the things that I do that, prepping in a primitive kind of way is my primary way of prepping. I think that's a good way for us to do, because I think the possibility of it getting that way, and I believe it would be more, and it's because I'm a man of the Bible, and I see kind of how the prophecies are in the end, and I think we are kind of living in the last days. And my belief is that you're going to eventually have a choice. You're going to have a choice to take a mark and be part of, the evil one world government where they protect you, but you have no freedoms, or you're going to have the option of running away from it all and probably never having much connections with the modern world and just being on your own. I think that's a possibility. I'm not saying it will happen. I'm just saying it's a possibility. So I know this, I just kind of thought, a lot of people watching this might think, man, this guy's nuts. He's talking about some extreme stuff. Let me pause for a moment and tell you my kind of philosophy when it comes to prepping. I think if I prep for the most extreme scenarios, and I try to think them up, if I'm prepped for a most extreme scenario that I can, then, which probably isn't very likely of happening, but because I am prepared mentally, physically, equipment, and everything else for the most extreme scenario, then that makes me prepared for all the things that are less than that extreme scenario. So that's kind of the philosophy that I go off of. Now, back to my hypothetical situations here. You can have a lot of food stored up. And, I've got a store on here, preparewithtravis.com, if you want to get some freeze-dried, dehydrated, number 10 canned food. Good stuff. That kind of stuff's good, but don't make that your only prep source. Don't make the food that you buy at the store and cans and dried goods and stuff your only prep. That's your only plan to survive on food. You need to be able to replenish that. And you may say, well, I've got a 12-month, 2-year, 3-year supply. Well, what if in 3 years the stores aren't back, manufacturing isn't back to where you can resupply? Then what are you going to do? Having a food prep that I recommend between a 2 and 3 year supply, all that is for, in my mind, is to give you a little bit of buffer, a 2 to 3 year buffer, to get yourself to the point that you are producing enough food to survive on. Because depending upon canned food, packaged food, some kind of produced food that you're getting from a store is not sustainable. If those never come back, what are you going to do? So the point is, if the apocalypse happens, the balloon goes up, you can't go to the store anymore, you live off of your prep supplies for 2 to 3 years while you're really getting much better at your gardening of producing food, raising food, foraging foods, and hopefully in 2 to 3 years you will have perfected it enough that you can truly live off of what you make with your own hands, or get with your own hands. That's what that's for. So it's the same way with, let's say, heating with wood. Let's say that your plan is, maybe you don't heat all the time, but your plan is, well, I'll heat with wood if things happen and I can't get electricity and I can't get propane or natural gas or whatever it is. I'll heat with wood. And I'll cut my own wood for my trees. So I've got my chainsaw. Well, what if it's such a long-term down situation that fuel doesn't come back and you run out of fuel for your chainsaw? Or the parts, something breaks. You may have a few extra parts, but you run out of parts, or something, you don't have a part 2 breaks. Then what do? You should have a backup, a contingency plan of some type of, say a 2-man crosscut saws, axes, things that you can fell a tree and process that tree in an old-fashioned way. Sure, it's way, way more work, but it's doable. Humans did it for hundreds and hundreds of years before the invention of the modern chainsaw. For instance, another example for us, we grind our own wheat for our bread, for flour. We make our own flour. Wheat berries last much, 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 much longer than flour does, and it's actually quite reasonable. It's pretty cheap, and so we grind our own. We have a grinder that's hand crank. Now the type that we have, you can attach a motor to it, so it's electrical, so you don't have to hand crank it all the time. But if there's no more electricity, I can hand crank it and we can have flour. A lot of our kitchen implements, we may have electrical, but we have backups that aren't electrical, that don't need any electricity. A lot of the tools that I use around the farm to do things with, I try to have primitive backups to them. And I think that this is something that, excuse me, while we're seeing kind of a lull a little bit, but I think it's starting, we're losing that lull in being able to resupply with what's going on. That may be some of your focus. If you say, you know what, I've got quite a bit of food stocked up, I've got a lot of, supplies stocked up. But are your supplies dependent upon a system either being there or the system coming back? Do you have primitive, pre-industrial, pre-technology type of equipment, tools to get you through and to survive on if there is no coming back to normal? Think of the early pioneers that went out west and the early homesteaders, that would go out, say, in their covered wagon. If they were lucky, they might have been able to resupply once a year, and some of them not even that. Some of them there wasn't a place to resupply nearby, and so they may go years before they could resupply. So they knew that what they had was it. They didn't have fuel. Some of them didn't, the lanterns they took, they may have run out of oil for their lanterns, so they had to have a backup for that. Their whole world was on that wagon, and that's kind of how we have to start being as preppers. I think the downside of the popularity of prepping has been we're still dependent. We have a lot of cool little gadgets. An old South word is little geegaws, If you don't know what that is, look it up. These little useless little gadgets that look cool, and they seem cool until they break, because they probably won't last that long, because most of them are made in China. And then, you're up creek without a paddle. I see guys post pictures of their bug out bags, and half of the stuff in there are little gadgets that may be cool if they work, but then what are you going to do if they don't work? So you have a primitive backup. And I think as homesteaders, as preppers, that is something that we must do, is begin having contingency plans for the different areas of your home: medical, cooking food, growing food, processing food, heat, energy sources, taking care of around the house, things like that. If the apocalypse happens and it's so big that it crushes society to the point that society doesn't come back, or you just can no longer be part of society because of the draconian rules, and so you have to live separated, set apart out in the woods, and not have connections with society. I think if you plan for these types of extremes, even though they may never come, it makes you a more prepared person. Start going through your plan. If your plan is to run off of a generator and you've got, even if you've got a week or 2 or 3 weeks supply of fuel, what happens when that fuel runs out and you can't go to the store, and maybe there's no gas stations ever again? Then what do you do? What do you do with that food? You plan on having this freezer and refrigerator running so that you can put food in it, and you go hunt and you process meat, on that you may grow, and your plan is to stick it in your freezer. But what happens when you can't run that freezer anymore? Do you have a backup to that to preserve meat long term? Maybe a smokehouse, root cellar, things like that. This is the level of preparedness that everyone probably needs to work towards. I think it's definitely a more advanced level of preparedness, to be prepared for the most extreme situation where society just never comes back, and you have to live pretty much a primitive life. And I'm not saying it is going to happen. I'm just saying that's the level of preparedness we need to get to. All right, folks, I'm going to cut this off because I'm going kind of long. I hope you understood and got the idea that I was getting to. I would encourage some conversation on this video. I think this would be a really good video to get a lot of conversation going, so let me know what you think. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.